Welcome everyone, it's Lindsay Bryan here. I'm the Director of Postgraduate Applied Finance at the Macquarie Business School, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which this university is situated, the Wadawurrung people of the Darug Nation, and pay our respects to Darug people and the Wadawurrung clan, and to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. It's a pleasure to introduce this session on such an important topic, and wonderful to have so many alumni and partners from industry with us today. The interest in today's session is not surprising, as unlike testing a vaccine, testing an accountability regime is not easy, yet it is vital to ensuring we can show its effectiveness. It is pleasing that we at Macquarie Business School can continue the strong links with the finance industry we enjoy, particularly through our Master of Applied Finance, and bring this research to you. Please join me in welcoming our chair, Naomi Burley. Naomi is the current Managing Director of the GRC Institute, working with compliance and risk management professionals closely over the past 15 years. Naomi is passionate about the value of compliance and those undertaking the work to build and embed compliance frameworks in organisations. Naomi, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and welcome everyone. This report is a really exciting development, and when Professor Sheedy approached GRCI to ask whether we could support both by touching base with our members to participate and to support as a financial supporter, we were more than keen to do so. The accountability regime has been a really interesting one for our members. A lot of compliance professionals were right in the thick of it in helping their organisations develop those accountability statements and have people understand that it actually provides role clarity and a bit of value around them understanding better their role. So it's very exciting to see the results of the survey, because I've had a sneak peek, and to see whether those benefits that we're hoping would flow through, whether they will or not. Again, for our members as well, and for APRA, I guess, they've really embraced that 3 lines of defence model. And for us, that's always been about accountability and about having role clarity. And that's one of the things that we were always hoping would come out of the accountability regime. So it'll be very interesting to see if that's part of the key findings. So I'd now like to welcome the research authors, but before I do so, what I'll let you all know as you click in, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A thing on the bottom bar of the Zoom meeting, and then you can also vote. If someone else has already submitted the question that you think is really important, you can vote that one up to the top, and I'll be reading those out a little bit later on in the session. But to introduce our report researchers, Professor Elizabeth Sheedy, I'm sure you all know, but she's a risk governance expert based at the Department of Applied Finance, specialising in risk governance, culture and remuneration in financial institutions. And she teaches courses on risk governance in the Master of Applied Finance and the Global MBA programs. Dr. Dominic Canestrari-So is based in the Department of Accounting and Corporate Governance, and he researches in governance and auditing and assurance and teaches undergraduate and postgraduate auditing courses. APRA, and our APRA update will also be provided by Stuart Bingham, the General Manager for Governance, Culture, Remuneration and Accountability at APRA, and we'll be introducing Stuart a little bit later on as well. So I'll hand over to Professor Sheedy and to Dr. Canestrari-So now, and thank you again for your time this morning, everyone.
Thanks very much, Naomi. It's been so terrific to work with you at the GRC Institute. We're extraordinarily grateful for your support and also the support of Archer. As everyone would understand, in university land, we're operating in an extremely constrained environment at the moment, and so the support of our industry partners is absolutely vital. But anyway, on to accountability. So, look, the principle of accountability is actually quite well understood. There was a lot of research that was done on this topic back in the 80s and the 90s. And the reason why we think accountability works so well is because humans are concerned about their status and reputation. We humans, as social creatures, care what other people think about us. So if we are expecting to have some kind of future evaluation, we tend to position ourselves to defend against possible criticism. So that's the underlying principle of accountability. Now, what's new is that we're starting to see regulations that are designed to enhance accountability. So this development started in the UK in 2016 with the Senior Managers and Certification regime, and our own BEAR regime was introduced from the middle of 2018. So what's the background? Why did this happen? Well, it came essentially out of public anger. So people in the community were furious that very often senior executives in banks, despite pretty egregious behaviour, never seemed to suffer any personal consequences. So people didn't seem to lose their jobs, they didn't seem to lose their bonuses, they certainly never seemed to go to jail. What the public wanted was heads on sticks. In other words, individual accountability. So that's what's been at the heart of these new regulations. And I should also mention that Singapore and Hong Kong have also gone down this path. So it seemed to be quite a new trend that's taking off, and we wanted to investigate it. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is just have a check to see how well you in this audience understand the BEAR. So often I find that people have misconceptions. We're just launching a poll now, and you'll see on the screen several statements about the BEAR. And what I'd like you to do is to quickly tick which ones you think are true. So I'll just give you a moment to complete the poll. Okay, so just 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the polling now and share the results with you. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that result. So in fact, of those 4 alternatives, only number 2 is true. APRA can't cancel bonuses, APRA can't fine individuals, APRA can't send people to jail. The only thing that's true is that a portion of bonuses are deferred for at least 4 years. So the way BEAR is intended to work is in fact that the directors are required to impose accountability. And they do it by clawing back bonuses and in some cases sacking senior executives that don't do their job. And of course, that's exactly what we saw in the case of Westpac when there was disappointing performance. It's only if the directors don't do their job, okay, if directors don't impose that accountability, then APRA can fine the organisation, but they can't fine individuals. So that's important to understand about the nature of the BEAR, and the accountability is really coming primarily through directors. APRA can also disqualify people from being accountable persons. That's the only other power that they have. So going back to the principles of accountability, a little bit of background. You probably already know that our brains operate in 2 systems. So there's that system 1, which is very intuitive, automatic. So when I look at that angry face, I instantly interpret it and I turn around and run. Whereas system 2 is the other brain system that's much more analytical, deliberative. That's what I'm using when I'm doing a calculation that involves pen and paper. Of course, if I was carefully reading a risk report, I would need my system 2 to be operating. But of course, system 2 is very tiring. Now, system 1, the problem here is that it tends to make lots of cognitive errors. This is where we see a lot of the behavioural biases like overconfidence, short-termism. So the theory behind accountability is that it's designed to boost system 2, to make people, to be more careful, to be more diligent, and therefore we might get better risk management outcomes. So in a management setting, the way that might play out is that we might expect accountable persons to be more careful in the way they delegate to the people below them. They might delegate more rigorously and then follow up more carefully to make sure that tasks have been properly carried out. They might be more diligent in responding to red flags that indicate that not all is well in their area of responsibility. So the question is whether these specific regulations are effective in enhancing individual accountability. We've already seen a couple of reports come out about the UK regime, and both of those have been quite positive. But of course, success in the UK doesn't guarantee success here in Australia. Different culture, different regulations, different regulators, and of course the rules are slightly different. So we thought it was important to have a good look at the Australian context. And what we did with the help of our industry partners was to conduct a series of confidential interviews. So we spent at least an hour with 41 interview participants. These 41 represented 15 different deposit-taking institutions. They were either senior executives or directors. Of the 41, 18 were designated accountable persons under the regime. Many of the rest of them were direct reports of accountable persons. We were very keen to talk to people who have good visibility of how the accountable persons are behaving. Okay? Because if BEAR is to be effective, you would expect to see that the behaviour of those accountable persons is already changing, that they are in fact being more diligent. We particularly targeted people in risk, compliance and assurance roles because we thought that those people would have the greatest insight into how risk management is being conducted around the organisation. So I guess the first and most obvious finding is that the BEAR has undoubtedly brought greater clarity about who is accountable for what. Okay? So if you're an accountable person, you will have very specific things listed next to your name that you are accountable for. And I think that is that goal of achieving clarity is itself an important benefit. So 80% of the people in our study said that they felt very clear on their responsibilities. Now, interestingly, the benefits that we observed in this study are not quite as positive as what has been observed in the UK. So I think that sort of slight difference between Australia and the UK, perhaps that's something that we could explore in Q&A if people are interested to go down that path. So why is clarity a good thing? Well, the first benefit of clarity, and I'd say this is the biggest surprise for me out of the study, has been a benefit in terms of empowerment of senior executives to act. So this is the idea that once you know that you have a clear accountability for something, then you're more inclined to actually get on and do something about it instead of faffing around. So for me, that was interesting. And you can see here on the screen a direct quote from one of our interviewees that really illustrates what I'm talking about, that accountability is actually helping things to get done. But I'm going to pause there and hand over to my colleague Dominic, and he will be taking you through the rest of our findings. Thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you, Dom.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'll carry on with the findings that we had in relation to the changes as a result of the BEAR. prior to going into the interviews, we administered a short survey to the participants. And one of the questions we asked was whether the bear had changed their behaviors. Many indicated that it hadn't, but over a third indicated that it had for the better. So this is something we explored in the interviews. And what we heard about was accountable persons being more likely to be thoughtful and self-reflective in their actions, and being more inclined to consult more and gather more information. This was in line with our findings of higher levels of reported felt accountability by accountable persons, indicating that they felt higher levels of scrutiny. We also heard of executives delegating responsibility in a more structured and rigorous fashion. They managed their reports more effectively through questioning, coaching, and offering constructive feedback. Poor performers are also more likely to be moved on after efforts have been made to offer support. More care is taken in prioritizing initiatives and resourcing them appropriately to ensure that accountabilities are met. So in other words, we found executives demonstrating more due care, skill, and diligence in their management. We also found support for improved practices in relation to boards and committees. We were told of directors being more willing to challenge, more likely to challenge executives. And in terms of committees, there was a sense that there is now diminished groupthink with the greater awareness that individuals and not committees are accountable. So one of the key manifestations of more care, skill, and diligence being exercised was greater consultation of compliance, legal, and risk functions. Almost 2/3 of the participants indicated that these functions now have a bigger say in decision-making in the organizations. This is part of demonstrating reasonable steps, but the effect of this has been to give these functions a stronger voice and a bigger say within the organizations as their line one colleagues consult them more. The BEAR has also helped with the resourcing of lines 2 and 3, as it's given chief risk officers and chief audit executives a frame of reference that no one can argue with. So ultimately, this has contributed to improvements in risk governance and culture within the organizations that we spoke to. And this is evident when we asked the question whether the BEAR had changed the culture at their organizations. Again, almost 2/3, a majority of whom were from compliance, legal, and audit functions, indicated that it had for the better. And this was a consistent theme to come through in the interviews as well. In particular, the BEAR appears to be having a favorable impact on the implementation of the 3 lines model of risk governance. Historically, one of the big risk culture challenges has been that senior people haven't listened to the concerns of those in lines 2 and 3. So the BEAR has helped in this regard. By clarifying line 1 accountability, executives are more proactive in their risk management. But another benefit has been in providing a frame of reference for assurance teams and directors in working out where accountability sits and who's on the hook when problems come up. As one of our participants bluntly, but perhaps fittingly expressed, it's allowed them to cut through the BS and to move issues towards resolution as they arise, whereas in the past, these may have been put in a too hard basket. So in essence, when problems emerge, the response is now faster and more thorough, indicating a more proactive risk culture. Now, we think it's important to note that the BEAR was introduced in what was a tumultuous time for the Australian financial services industry. This made it somewhat challenging to separate out the specific impact of the BEAR effect from everything else that was going on in the industry over the last few years. Several participants were of the opinion that the events of the last few years had simultaneously influenced perceptions and practices within the organizations that had set about improvements in risk governance. So while they couldn't definitively point to the extent to which the BEAR was responsible for change, they were generally of the opinion that the Bear had reinforced these improvements. So our observation is that there's somewhat of an interaction effect. The effect of the Bear has been to magnify the impact of the events of the last few years in industry on risk governance. Increased executive accountability through the regime has meant that scandals in the industry, even those occurring in other organizations, has become a potent force for change. When executives see their peers suffering shame and financial consequences, it invokes a powerful fear response because of their own individual accountabilities. For example, participants referred to the AML issue in Westpac as being the catalyst for them to review AML processes and to invest more in this complex area in their own organizations. The fear of facing similar consequences has meant that investments in risk governance that may not have been approved in the pre-Bear era have now become possible. So moving on then to the drawbacks of the Bear. What was interesting for us to note was that the drawbacks were really not as important in practice as had been anticipated. With the exception of the increased administrative burden, as you would expect with the new legislation, the other drawbacks were discussed by participants in prospective terms as being potential risks that might eventuate rather than ones they had actually observed post-implementation. So the increased administrative burden was the most commonly cited unfavorable effect of the Bear. For some, this related to the overdrive in documentation and evidencing reasonable steps. And for others, it was the frustration with the admin work involved in effecting minor accountability changes within the organization. Of course, some noted that the increase in documentation was useful in improving decision-making and prompting more reflection by executives. Now, in terms of fear and stress as a result of the Bear, we didn't find any evidence of this in practice, although it's worth noting that some participants noted that increased accountability needs to be carefully managed to ensure that it does not produce inappropriate fear that inhibits speaking up or resolution of audit issues. Likewise, with issues around recruiting or retaining senior executives in the industry, there was no evidence of this in the organizations that we spoke to. Instead, the participants were generally of the opinion that increased accountability is appropriate for senior executives and that they should be willing to accept the increased scrutiny. Prior to the implementation of the Bear, there were concerns that the focus on individual accountability might lead to a loss of collegiality. Executives would be so concerned with their individual domains of accountability that they may be less inclined to cooperate, leading to siloed approaches to management. Following implementation, however, fears in this regard seem to have largely been allayed, and this is seen as a relatively minor issue. In fact, there was a participant that expressed the view that clarity of accountability within their organization had in fact improved cooperation and collegiality. So to sum up, the Bear appears to be having its intended effect of advancing risk governance and culture within the organizations. And participants were generally in consensus that it's had a positive net effect in their organizations. The benefits, however, did not accrue uniformly across all the organizations that we spoke to. And of course, we acknowledge that this was limited to the first year or two of the Bear's operation. So to finish off, I wanted to share some of our reflections on factors that might inhibit or moderate the Bear's effectiveness currently, as well as looking forward. The first relates to the enthusiasm with which the Bear was implemented. We observed a range of enthusiasm levels across the organizations. Those that took a more enthusiastic approach were more likely to leverage the opportunity of the Bear to drive accountability throughout the organization, not just at the accountable person level. The prominence of the Bear was also maintained in their organizations through formal reporting mechanisms against Bear accountabilities and internal reviews of the Bear's implementation and operation. On the other hand, the Bear effect was less pronounced for those that took a less enthusiastic approach, whether due to resources or perhaps overconfidence or capability, which leads me to my next point on capability. The success of the bear is reliant on the capability of accountable persons and executives to successfully manage and delegate responsibility. While in one sense, this might seem like management 101, participants pointed out that capability cannot be assumed. And as one expressed, accountability without capability is entrapment. So perhaps there's more work to be done here with training and coaching of some executives in this regard. The next factor relates to the interaction effect that I spoke about. So the success and impact of the bear needs to be understood within the context of the events of the last few years in the industry. Looking forward, however, as the memories of these events start to fade, it's possible that we may start to see a fading of the bear effect as well. But of course, this is the challenge of ongoing risk governance. Finally, the concerns were raised about the design of the bear and the regulator's ability to win cases brought under the bear. But is this really a concern? Perhaps not, if directors are willing to impose executive accountability themselves, as we saw happen in the case of Westpac. Fortunately, we also currently seem to be an environment where institutional investors are keen to support executive accountability. So perhaps it's not that big of an issue. It remains to be seen. But of course, the regulator has other avenues to influence the bear implementation. So on that note, I'll stop here and hand over to Stuart to speak to us from the regulator's perspective.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Elizabeth, so much. For that, I will like to welcome Stuart Bingham, the General Manager of Governance, Culture, Remuneration and Accountability in the Cross-Industry Insights and Data Division of APRA. Stuart, that is a mouthful. They really need to shorten that one for you. Stuart has held numerous roles in his almost 13 years at APRA and is a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries of Australia. He has more than 30 years experience in the life insurance and wealth management industry. And just a quick reminder, we've got some questions coming up in the Q&A, but keep posting your questions there. But I will hand over to Stuart now. Welcome.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this event. I think it's a very important topic that we're talking about today. And it's great to be able to exchange ideas and views on the importance of getting accountability right. Can I just check that I'm being heard, that I've got my settings right?
You sure are.
Okay, thank you. And also this research is particularly timely, as APRA has also recently published an information paper late last year on its review of the BEARS implementation across 3 of our major banks. And that was completed in February last year. And this publication forms part of our strategy to use transparency to help transform governance, risk culture, remuneration, and accountability. And I agree that is very much a mouthful. And so we shorten it to GCRA within APRA. So the scope of our paper was to provide transparency, as I said, into the approaches of 3 large banks, that being ANZ, CBA, and NAB. To implement the BEAR roughly 18 months after the effective legislation date. The review was primarily based on a desktop review of key documentation to implement the BEAR. We held formal sessions with each bank over 1.5 days, and we held interviews with 4 executive and 2 non-executive accountable persons at each bank. We also wanted to identify a range of better practice observations to help the broader banking industry to improve their own accountability arrangements and to provide insights into the approach taken by APRA to administer the BEAR. And we were very keen to make sure when we did this work to be careful to point out that this was observations based on 3 large banks, and we certainly didn't have an expectation that everything that they were doing would be implemented by the full range of ADIs across the regulated space. So if I could go to the next slide. So what did we find? So there's a lot of similar findings to the research paper that's just been presented. And we did find that the BEAR had produced a number of positive outcomes across the three major banks. So thematically, we found that the implementation of BEAR has helped to clarify accountability for a range of stakeholders. So firstly, for the accountable persons themselves, it's helped to improve clarity, understanding, and transparency of individual accountability in business as usual conditions before an event goes wrong or a risk crystallizes. This in turn should provide accountable persons with a greater sense of individual accountability and should increase the momentum for them to take remedial or preventative action to deliver on their obligations. Secondly, it's helped to generate more challenging and engaging board oversight, as directors commented that it made it easier for them to ask sharper questions directly to the relevant accountable person and to more comprehensively question what actions they had taken to address their concerns. In turn, if the board is not satisfied that the accountable person is taking sufficient action, the board would be empowered to take consequence management actions, including reducing the accountable person's variable remuneration. And then finally, from a regulatory perspective, we have found that the BEAR has facilitated more targeted engagement with entities to achieve our prudential outcomes. And in the paper, we listed a number of examples of how we have used the BEAR to sharpen banks' focus on delivering timely remediation actions. And just one example I'll bring that brings that to life was one of our regulated entities had long outstanding issues with data submissions, and remediation activity was not proving to be effective. So what we did, we wrote to the entity and requested to know who the accountable person was for the data submission. And within 2 weeks of the entity acknowledging who was accountable, the quality of the reporting had improved substantially. So the BEAR can have quite powerful impacts in the work that we do. And so consistent with our international peers, we are a forward-looking supervisor. And so we primarily aim to use BEAR constructively to influence banks and accountable persons to take actions proactively to address risks and issues. However, where this does not lead to the right outcomes, we are prepared to take formal enforcement action should that be warranted. In the paper, we also made a number of better practice observations. And so the review identified these practices that can help banks to better implement the BEAR and drive better accountability in practice. At a high level, we found that the most effective approaches had centralized resources to implement and operate the BEAR at their bank so that they provide meaningful support to accountable persons to meet their obligations. They also had robust processes in place to ensure that accountabilities remain clear and accurate on an ongoing basis. This was generally achieved through due diligence processes and handover requirements between executives, but also included conducting regular stress scenarios to test how accountabilities would actually play out in practice. Frameworks to support accountable persons to take reasonable steps to deliver on their accountabilities were in place, and to periodically monitor and oversee the practices being used by accountable persons to meet their obligations. There was also integrated consequence management and remuneration frameworks to clearly reinforce the link between accountability obligations and remuneration outcomes. And it ensured that the board reflected on its practices to demonstrate reasonable steps of the individual directors. So in conclusion, the review provided APRA with a really good opportunity to assess the large bank's implementation of the regime 18 months after its effective date, and hopefully provides the industry, academics and other interested parties with useful information and references. Over time, we will expect all stakeholders, accountable persons, the boards, and us as regulators, to continue to improve and embed the regime to achieve its intended objectives and we will certainly welcome further discussion on this topic with interested parties in the future. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to just present in a brief way at this webinar. And I look forward to the questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you, Stuart, for that. Sorry, I have the usual Zoom thing where I couldn't unmute myself to save my life. We have had some interesting questions come up there. And I am going to go with the top voted one because it's an interesting one. I have some thoughts on this myself, but to everyone on the panel, what do you think of the view that BEAR was unnecessary because it is already covered by existing principles of corporate law, if only they were meaningfully enforced?
I'll make a stab at it. So I think the problem with the existing laws is that as they stand, there wasn't enough clarity about who individually was responsible for particular issues. And one of the big problems you have is that, when everyone's responsible, no one is responsible. So that's the big difference with BEAR. So you have individuals with specific issues next to their name. That's how you get this individual accountability effect. What do you think, Stuart?
So I would reflect on, we did the CBA inquiry, and then we did we had the self-assessments from 36 entities. And what we found in those processes were that accountabilities were unclear. They weren't effectively cascaded through the organisations, and that they weren't effectively enforced. And so, what the BEAR tries to do is to drive significant improvements in the way entities operate and to be much sharper around transparency and accountability. And so that I come back to the purpose of the BEAR, and it was addressing weaknesses that we were seeing in industry at the time.
Naomi, anything that you'd add to that?
I think I would have to reiterate that a lot of the anecdotal feedback we had from members was that the exercise was incredibly valuable to have senior executives and directors understand they were accountable and how they were accountable. So walking them through that process. I also think the way that it's structured, leaving it to the directors to look after the bonus and make that decision and enforce it internally is much more effective, because again, when it's sitting in the Corps Act outside of the organisation, it's often up to the compliance person to keep re-emphasising, we can get in trouble for this, we can get in trouble for this. And they're the only ones saying that in the organisation instead of the directors. So I think it's a bit of nudge theory. I think it's incredibly valuable for that.
Good.
So I hope that answered that top question. One of the other interesting questions was, and probably Elizabeth, and I mean, I'm sure Stuart has some insights into this as well, but is there any evidence to suggest that BEAR has resulted in increased inefficiencies within organisations through the introduction of increased committees and meetings, and has this led to organisations being less willing to take business risk and innovate and drive growth?
Yes, so it was an issue that we were particularly conscious of, because it was one of the findings from the UK study was, they raised this question about whether their accountability regime was making organisations more risk averse. So it wasn't a strong finding, but it was certainly raised as a possibility. What we found really was, we didn't find any evidence of that happening. And in fact, to the contrary, that the finding about the empowerment, I thought was really interesting, that when it's clear who is responsible, actually things are more inclined to get done. Now, yes, it is true. So, they will, I think accountable persons will definitely consult. Okay, they will, and and as part of demonstrating reasonable steps, they will consult with colleagues in risk and compliance, for example, to make sure that they have understood that any concerns from that quarter. But I mean, that's appropriate, right? That's what should be happening. People shouldn't be rushing to make important business decisions without carefully consulting and considering about the risk implications. So I don't think that we could say that this regime is leading to any inappropriate slowness in decision making or additional risk aversion. Stuart, was that how you saw it from your review?
Yeah, it wasn't particularly a topic that we were looking to address as part of the review we did. So I was very interested in the findings of the research. And, you know, one of the things I was very pleased about the findings of the research was, you know, the fears around increased administration burden and other things didn't turn out to be as big as what we first thought might have been the case. And certainly when we think about the reasonable steps accountable people are taking, you know, we have seen evidence of more documentation being put in place, you know, more record keeping and other things, but we're not seeing that being seen as a huge burden. I think the other thing is that, you know, we think that sharpened accountability actually makes for better risk reward decisions. And while we haven't examined that issue in any depth to see whether that's actually taking place or not, I think it's, you know, that's the purpose. You know, and we're not seeing any evidence of what Elizabeth was mentioning in the UK regime, that, you know, there's a slowness or an unwillingness to take appropriate risks within the banks.
Thank you. That's very encouraging to see that, and I would have hoped that wasn't the case. Now we've got a top question. I don't know whether you collected this data, but for the 2% who felt that behaviour had changed for the worse as a result of BEAR, what were some of the negative behaviour traits they observed? Did they give you any detail on that?
Dominic, do you want to take this one?
So this was clearly in the minority. First up, I think these did not come from accountable persons. So these were reports. And I think this was reflecting the increased expectations cascading down. And so you know, and I mean, I think the net positive was, it was a net positive in a sense that they were working harder. Whether that was a good thing for them or not is a different story. But it was reflecting that cascading down coming through for the direct report that indicated that their behavior had not changed for the better necessarily. Things were a little bit more frantic, I think, in that particular case. Elizabeth, would you add anything?
Yeah, so I think most people felt that accountable persons were, you know, handling their accountabilities well. There were perhaps one or two people that were a little bit unhappy with how accountable persons were behaving, and that, you know, they were creating too, it was all becoming too stressful, and the demands were just becoming a bit ridiculous. Perhaps that was an example of excessive fear, or, you know, people being placed into accountable person roles that were perhaps not suited to that role. So I guess it comes back to the point about having the right capability. Obviously, not everyone is suited to taking on that kind of responsibility. It's a big commitment. But on the other hand, if you're going to earn the big bucks and take on those very senior roles, I think most people in the community would say you have to have those skills. You have to be able to handle that degree of pressure.
Thank you. Now we have someone who's snuck in 3 questions at once, but I'm actually going to go to one that I think Stuart may or may not be able to deal with a little bit quickly. That there's a perception that there's some overlap or confusion between the BEAR accountable persons and CPS 520 on responsible persons. And the question is around, when will this be resolved?
So APRA recently released a paper on our policy priorities, and what's listed in there is that we are looking at our governance and risk management standards. So that's CPS 220, 510, 520. At the moment, we've got that as something that we're hoping to look at in 2022. So, and what we'll do as we go through that process is think about that alignment issue and how all those things come together. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, another one again that will sort of throw to all of you, I think, because I think some of the APRA work will also give an idea here. The no proportion in some of the questions was pretty significant. And so what was your takeaway from that? Do you think it reflects a genuine lack of cut through of BEAR, or do you think that those organisations already had a strong governance and accountability and they didn't require BEAR to uplift this? What's the feeling around those?
Okay, so remember we did Dominic comment on the fact that the implementation approach was different in different organisations. So there were some banks that implemented what I would call a BEAR light approach. In other words, they did sort of the minimum, to adopt the regime. So naturally, when that happens, you would not expect the benefits to be as great. So then I guess that begs the question, well, why didn't they take it seriously? Why did they not adopt it more enthusiastically? Look, I think there's a range of reasons. Sometimes it could be overconfidence, as the questioner suggests. Okay, they might feel, everything's fine here. Sometimes in a couple of the smaller organisations, I think there's possibly a resourcing issue. Although I will say there were some of the smaller organisations that we spoke to that had, I think, had made a very good fist of it. Dominic, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add that I think contrary to the expectation that organizations that already had a strong culture, the BEAR would have a less pronounced impact, we saw the opposite. So those that had the stronger culture were more likely to leverage the BEAR implementation to further implement. And it was just aligning that accountability with the culture that they have and strengthening that further.
Okay, so it's not a case of so much that we don't need the BEAR because we've already got this. They were ready to embrace it. Was that your feel from the interviews?
I'd say so.
Yeah. I mean, what tends to happen when people have a stronger risk culture, they understand that there's always more they can do. Okay, that there's that sense of chronic unease, and I'm quoting an APRA report there. We can always do better. No one has arrived at the top of the risk maturity ladder yet.
Excellent. Now we've had a couple of interesting questions down the bottom which we might not have an answer to, but certainly around that capability angle for accountable persons. Is there the questioner asks, is there any sense that you'll be requiring them to have be qualified governance professionals or have a specific sort of governance angle on those capabilities, or do you think that that's not what's actually required in those situations?
Stuart, do you want to jump on that?
So I'm not quite sure what the question is getting at there. The issue around capabilities is really a matter for boards to decide, and making sure that their accountable persons have the appropriate skills and qualifications and experience to be able to do the job. And as opposed to in the UK regime, you'd be aware that the regulator actually interviews accountable persons and directors. We didn't go down that path. Mainly because we saw that was very clearly the responsibility of the board to do that, rather than the responsibility of the regulator.
I think that covers that question. And I guess there's one for Elizabeth and Dominic around the methodology. I was a little bit part of this process, but what was your rationale for the questions that were asked in the report? And I guess since everyone's going to get a copy of the report, it would be interesting to have a little bit of a discussion and maybe step back to the other research you've done in this area, Elizabeth.
Okay, so with the questions that we selected, in some ways, in some cases, we replicated questions from the UK finance study because we thought it would be helpful then to be able to make comparisons across the two regimes. And that I think is interesting that we did see that while we think the BEAR has had a positive effect here in Australia, the positives they're seeing in the UK are even greater. Now, that could be because they have had the regime for longer, okay? And so it's bedded in better. But I think it's also worth wondering whether the differences in the design could be having an effect also. So, for example, Stuart just mentioned a moment ago, one difference in design is in the UK, every prospective accountable person goes in and has a pretty, rigorous, shall we say, interview with the regulator. And having spoken to someone who's been through that process, that interview process certainly does concentrate the mind, and it makes the accountability very salient. So, things like small differences in design can potentially have quite a powerful effect. Another difference is that in the UK, the regulator has powers to fine and jail individuals, which is a power that APRA doesn't currently have. It will be interesting to see whether any of these things get thought through when we go to the next stage of looking at FAR, the Financial Accountability Regime, when it's rolled out more broadly across the sector. So that was one thing. We wanted to make comparisons. We also were asking, there was a pre-interview survey, and some of the things we did there were a little bit different from the UK finance study. So for example, we did a Big Five personality test. Okay, so we wanted to see whether people in accountable person roles had different kinds of personalities to others. We thought that would be interesting. We did come, we also asked questions about the risk culture of the organisation using our Macquarie University risk culture scale. Because I think most people accept that accountability and culture are closely linked. And so we wanted to try and tease out some of those relationships. So there, I think ultimately, we'll be trying to get a publication in a scholarly journal. And of course, we had to ask some questions and delve into some issues to try and address issues that are still unresolved in the academic literature. But as it turns out, I think most of those issues are of interest to the industry as well. And they're not just esoteric matters. And, quite honestly, I'm not interested in doing research that's only going to be read by other academics.
Look, I certainly found all of the questions relevant in the report and thought the responses were interesting. But to a point you made just then about that sort of intersect with culture, there's a question here about sort of delving into what's your take on the 17% of people who responded saying that the BEAR changed the culture of the organisation for the worse?
So that would be, I would say those would be people who were commenting about the administrative burden, okay? And undoubtedly that is an issue, okay? So, we have to accept that a regulation like this does create administrative burdens. There's a little cottage industry of, notifications to APRA. So, letting APRA know when there is a change in someone's accountability statement, or when there is, the accountability maps change and, someone changes job. So, and also obviously collecting all of the information about reasonable steps and so forth to evidence the accountability. So I would say those people would be talking about the fact that, yes, there is, it's more admin, and in some cases they haven't really seen the benefits. So I would describe that as that's typical of the BEAR light implementation. Okay, so yes, they've adopted BEAR, but not well enough to really get the upside. Okay, so it's the worst possible outcome. You've got some of the costs without the benefits.
Or even they're still stuck in that step where everyone's afraid of it. They haven't worked through it to understand that it helps them clarify that they're not responsible for everything.
Yeah, true enough.
Yeah.
Mm.
To Stuart as well, we had a question here around the likelihood that APRA would make organisations need to document out the reasonable steps so that they can demonstrate their assurance. I will sort of throw in there as well, was there anything out of the study that you guys have done at this stage that means that you might tweak things or ask for more or less from organisations?
So once again, it's up for the entities themselves to work out, how to document the reasonable steps. We will certainly go in and review what entities have done. And what we did was we actually saw a range of practices, and we've listed those in the information paper, and we hope that that's useful to the industry as they consider what reasonable steps accountable persons are taking within their own organisation. In terms of tweaking, I'd just make the more general comment about FAR, and that all the feedback that has been received about issues with BEAR, as Treasury and APRA and ASIC work through, the FAR regime, that all that feedback is being taken into account.
You've preempted one of my questions. Well done. One last quick question, and this is to everyone. There's a question there about what's your opinion, and it is just an opinion, on the value of making that accountability document available more broadly within an organisation, so that everyone who it's reasonable to give it access to, so that they understand who's accountable for what. Do you think there's value in that, or that it should be kept within the accountable person?
I'm a great believer in transparency. The more, the better. I don't see any point in keeping that kind of information secret.
I'd agree with that. I think what we've learnt over the last few years and around transparency is very important, and I would think it would be an excellent idea for the accountability statements to be made available throughout the organisation.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you, Professor Sheedy. Thank you, Dr. Kanastrari for your time. Thank you, everyone who logged into the call. We are at time. We're at 11 o'clock. So if you if you know someone who wasn't able to get on, please assure them that the report and a recording of this will be sent out to them. I'd like to thank RSA as well for co-supporting the study. I don't think they managed to make it on the call, and I'll hand over to Lindsay if he wants to say a few words in close.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Thank you to Stuart, to Dominic, and to Elizabeth, and thank you for coming along today. That ends the podcast. The webcast. So we'll now say goodbye. Thank you.